Wyoming Territory, June of 1882. Dust swirled up behind the wagon wheels as Delaney Gracewell stepped down from the stagecoach in the middle of bent willows, a town barely more than a cluster of wooden buildings and dirt streets. Her boots hit the ground just as a sharp gust tugged her bonnet sideways. She set her jaw and straightened it, eyes scanning the people who had already started whispering. "That the one from Missouri?" A woman hissed too loudly behind her hand. "The Barren one. Husband died 2 years back." Never gave him an heir. Delaney didn't flinch. She had heard worse. She held her chin high, even as the laughter started behind her, low and sharp. "Poor things got more petticoats than sense, common out here alone." She walked past them, her back ironed straight. She had come to Wyoming for a new start, not to be dragged by the past. But it followed her like a shadow, same as the grief in her bones. Her plan was clear: take the teaching job offered by Reverend Baker, keep her head down, earn her own living. No more depending on the kindness of relatives who looked at her like a cracked cup. The schoolhouse was still half a frame, and the boarding room behind it smelled like old lye soap and mice. But it was hers for now. She stood on the porch that night, arms wrapped around herself, watching the sun bleed out across the plains. Then came shouting from down the road, children yelling, a horse neighing in protest. A tall man came into view, boots heavy on the dirt, with a little girl perched on his shoulders, 2 boys chasing after him, and a 4th child, another girl, arms folded and unimpressed, walking stiffly behind. "Stop running or you'll ruin your boots again," the man called, his voice deep and rich. Delaney bristled at the sound of her heart skipping and then scolded herself. She had not come here for that. The children barreled past her porch, the girl on the man's shoulders squealing with laughter. He stopped when he saw her. His hat came off and he nodded politely. "Ma'am," he said, "didn't mean to cause a racket, just letting them blow off the day." "Quite all right," Delaney replied, trying not to stare at the way the sun lit up his sandy hair and strong jaw. "I'm Ridge Johnson," he said, stepping closer. His eyes were the color of river stones, calm and unreadable. "I run cattle just east of town. These are mine Fay, Forrest, Fern, and Fletcher. Their ma passed 2 winters ago," Delaney swallowed. "Delaney Gracewell, I am the new school teacher. Then I reckon we'll be seeing plenty of you. These 4 are more trouble than a dust storm in July." He glanced down at Fletcher, who was trying to sneak behind her porch to catch a toad. Delaney smiled before she could stop herself. "Sounds like a lively home." Ridge's eyes lingered on her a moment. "It's got too much silence in it, truth be told." The children tugged him away, and she watched them go, a knot in her throat she did not quite understand. The next week passed with heat, hammering, and the sound of saws as the schoolhouse came together. Ridge showed up twice with extra lumber and once with a sack of apples. He worked in silence mostly, but his presence settled the air around her like a calm wind. It was Fletcher who asked the question first. "Why do they call you Barren?" Delaney froze, brush mid-stroke on the chalkboard. The boy was only 7, but his eyes were too sharp for his age. "That is not a kind thing to repeat, Fletcher," she said softly. "I did not mean it mean," he said, climbing up on the bench. "Just don't know what it means." "It means," she said gently, "that some people think a woman is only worth something if she has babies, and I could not have any." He nodded, serious as a preacher. "You can still be nice." She laughed, the sound surprising her. "Thank you." That evening, Ridge returned to collect his children. Delaney handed him a note from Fern saying she needed more paper. He glanced at her, then at the setting sun. "You got supper plans?" She blinked. "No." "Then come by the homestead. Kids would like it, I would too." Her heart jumped in a way that felt dangerous and foolish, but she nodded. The Johnson homestead was modest but warm. a two-room cabin with a front stoop and a vegetable patch. Supper was stew and cornbread, and the children buzzed around her like bees. Ridge watched quietly from across the table, his gaze steady and unreadable. After the children went to bed, he stayed by the fire with her. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable. "You came out here alone," he said finally. "That takes grit." "I did not want to be pitied anymore," she said. "Or whispered about," he nodded. "People talk. Let them." "You did not deserve any of it." She looked at him, the weight of his words hitting deeper than she expected. "You are not less of a woman," Ridge said, voice low and steady, "for what you could not give that man." She blinked quickly. "You barely know me. I know enough. I know you are kind to my children. I know you work hard. And I know that being laughed at does not mean they are right." She turned her face toward the fire, but he reached out and placed a calloused hand over hers. "I've got 4 kids who need a ma, Delaney." Her breath caught. "And I think," he added, voice quiet, "maybe you need a place where you are not made to feel broken." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in a long while she felt something settle in her chest. Hope. Warm and real. He did not look away, neither did she. Delaney returned to the schoolhouse late that evening, the scent of wood smoke still clinging to her shawl. The stars above Wyoming stretched wide and quiet, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the silence didn't feel like a weight pressing in. The next morning brought a chill that clung to the grasses and crept through the window seams. She lit the stove early and boiled water for tea, listening to the first crow's call from the cottonwoods. The schoolhouse still lacked proper benches, but the children didn't complain. They sat on crates on the floor wherever they could, and they listened mostly. Fern had begun staying after lessons, not out of mischief, but to help straighten things. She was quiet, watchful, and never once asked anything personal. On the 4th afternoon, as they swept the chalk dust together, Fern paused. "Do you miss where you came from?" Delaney leaned on the broom. "Not the town, no. I miss the green hills sometimes, and my sister. She married a miller, lives near the Gasconade." Fern nodded like she understood. "Sometimes I miss Mama's singing. Faye doesn't remember, but I do." Delaney knelt beside her and touched her hand. "You're brave to remember." Fern didn't reply, but she stayed close while Delaney locked up the door. That Saturday, Ridge rode into town with a second-hand dresser tied across the back of his wagon and a bag of dry beans slung over his shoulder. He found Delaney at the mercantile, exchanging half a dozen eggs for a bolt of muslin. "You puttin' together that place of yours?" he asked, nodding at the fabric. She folded it carefully. "Trying. The mattress is full of straw and lumps. I wake up feeling like I've been in a fist fight." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I've got an extra feather tick. Mama made it for my folks before they passed. It's been wrapped in oilcloth in the loft. You're welcome to it. I can't take that. You'd be doing me a favor. It's just gathering dust." She glanced up, searching his face for any hint of pity. There wasn't any. "I'd be grateful then," she said. He tipped his hat, then paused. "You free tomorrow afternoon? I was thinkin' of tackin' the kids down to the river bend for a picnic. Water's low enough now. They'd like if you came." Delaney hesitated. "Do you usually invite the schoolteacher to your family gatherings?" Never had reason to before. She wrapped the muslin tight and nodded once. "All right." Sunday brought a softer sun, filtered through thin clouds. Ridge's wagon creaked down the trail toward the bend, with Fletcher and Forrest tossing pebbles at fence posts and Faye singing some nonsense tune to her doll. Delaney rode beside Ridge on the bench seat, her hands clasped in her lap. "You always this quiet?" Ridge asked, eyes on the trail. "I spent years with people who only spoke to judge. Silence became easier." He nodded slowly. "I figure quiet folks just got more to hold." They reached the river bend near midday. The children kicked off boots and ran for the shallows, shrieking with delight. Ridge spread a wool blanket over the grass, then opened a tin of bread and cold meat. Delaney removed the jar of pickled carrots she'd brought and set it down between them. "You make these?" he asked, lifting the lid. "Grew the carrots myself. Learned the brining from an old German widow back home." He took a bite, then whistled low. "You know, if you keep feeding me like this, I might forget how to boil coffee." She laughed quietly. "Is that a threat or a promise? Could be both." They watched the children for a while. Fletcher had found a frog and was explaining something about its legs to Forrest, who looked unconvinced. Fern sat on a flat rock, braiding reeds into a loose circle. Fay was twirling in the shallows, skirts soaked, face lifted to the sky. "My oldest," Ridge said, nodding toward Fern. "She don't say much, but she sees everything. Took it the worst when Clara passed. Wouldn't eat for 2 weeks. I had to carry her to the table." Delaney kept her eyes on the girl. "What helped? Time, and letting her be near the horses. She brushes them like they're made of glass. Thinks I don't know she slips them sugar cubes." Delaney said nothing, but her heart tugged with quiet ache. She touched the edge of the reed braid Fern had left behind when she ran to splash her brothers. As the sun dipped low, Ridge stood and offered her his hand. She took it, rising slowly. His grip was firm, warm, and when he didn't let go right away, she didn't pull away. "I never plan to start again," she said, voice low. "I'm not asking you to rush into anything," Ridge replied. "But I'm not blind to what's happening. You're good for them. You're good for me." She looked up into his face, the lines around his eyes softened by the gold light. "I don't know if I remember how to be part of something." "You don't have to remember," he said. "You just have to let it happen." Fay called for her from the water's edge, holding a dripping bouquet of river lilies. Delaney let go of Ridge's hand, but not the warmth it left behind. She stepped into the shallows, skirts wet to her knees, and took the flowers with a laugh that felt new in her chest. Ridge watched her, the corners of his mouth lifting not in amusement, but something gentler, something real. The sun sank behind the hills, and the shadows lengthened, but no one hurried to leave. The wind came down from the hills the next morning, dry and sharp, carrying the scent of distant sage and stirred dust. Delaney buttoned her shawl higher around her throat as she walked the narrow path behind the schoolhouse, a tin pail swinging from her hand. Ridge had sent Fletcher by at dawn with a folded note and a crooked grin, asking if she'd come help with the harvest of early apricots, said the trees were heavy and the children too light to reach the top branches. She hesitated only a moment before writing her answer on the back of a receipt and tucking it into the boy's vest pocket. By midday, she stood in the Johnson orchard, hem pinned up to keep the grit from catching, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. The trees were low and twisted, their leaves leathery with wind, but the fruit hung golden and full. Ridge passed her a ladder without a word, just the briefest glance that settled somewhere deep behind her ribs. "You ever climb trees back in Missouri?" he asked, brushing dust from a crate. "Only once," she said, setting her pail down. "To escape a cousin who thought it amusing to chase me with a bullfrog." He chuckled, and it was a sound she hadn't heard from him before, low, warm, and unguarded. "You get away." I fell into the sheep pen. Call that a victory. They worked in silence for a while, the creak of wood and rustle of branches filling the space between them. From further down the row, Fern and Forrest argued over which fruit was too soft to keep. Fay sat beneath one of the trees, feeding apricot halves to her doll. Fletcher had wandered off with a stick and was now poking at something in the grass with great intent. Delaney reached for a cluster just out of reach, her fingers brushing the smooth skins. The ladder shifted slightly beneath her boots. "Careful," Ridge said, stepping forward and steadying the side with one hand. "Wood's old. I meant to mend it last fall but didn't get the time." She looked down at him. "I'm not made of glass." "No, ma'am. But I figure you're still worth catching if you fall." She blinked once, then turned her attention back to the fruit, her movements slower now, more deliberate. Later, with crates stacked and fruit sorted, Ridge led her to the back porch while the children ran wild through the tall grass. He poured 2 tin cups of well water from the pump and handed her one. "My mother used to soak apricots in vinegar and sugar," he said, watching the horizon. "Let them sit till the jars turned amber. I never liked the taste, but I'd eat 'em anyhow." She said it was good for the blood. Delaney took a sip from her cup. "My father swore by sassafras tea, said it made his joints stop aching. All it ever did was stain the pot red." He looked over at her, then not curious, not cautious, but steady. "You ever think about leaving again?" he asked. She took her time answering. "I used to tell myself I'd keep going west till I found somewhere that didn't feel like looking backward. But the truth is, I think I was always waiting for something to feel like belonging." He nodded, slow, then set his cup down. "I won't ask you to say yes to anything now, but I want you to know this house has room." She didn't speak, didn't need to. The air around them felt changed, settled. That evening, she helped Fern measure flour while Ridge chopped wood out back. The girl worked with quiet precision, her braids slipping loose as she leaned over the bowl. "You do it different than Mama," Fern said, "but it still smells good." Delaney reached for the salt. "Different doesn't mean wrong." Fern looked up at her, then nodded once and went back to stirring. As dusk fell, Ridge carried the last of the firewood inside. His sleeves were dark at the cuffs where sweat had soaked through, and his hair stuck damp to his brow. "You staying for supper?" he asked, not presuming, just hopeful. She folded the towel over the baked biscuits and looked up. "If I do, I'll need to walk back by lantern. I'll walk with you." Her voice caught before she could stop it. "You don't have to do that." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I know." The meal passed with clatter and crumbs, laughter tumbling out of the children like river water. Delaney sat at the end of the table, Ridge seated across from her, both of them content to watch. Afterward, with the children tucked into quilts and the lantern lit low, Ridge walked her back toward town. The stars hung heavy above them, and their boots pressed soft prints into the dirt. "I used to wonder if I was meant to be alone," she said after a long stretch of quiet. "You're not," Ridge answered. "Not if you don't want to be." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "I'm not afraid of being needed," she said. "What scared me was not being enough." He stepped closer, close enough she could feel the warmth off him. "You're more than enough." The words weren't hurried. They weren't sweetened. They were just true. She reached for his hand. He took it. And they stood there, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, no longer broken, no longer waiting. The air turned brittle with the shifting season. By late September, the cottonwoods had begun to yellow at their edges, and the tall grass bowed under the weight of cool wind. Delaney kept her shawl close in the mornings now, and she brought extra kindling to the schoolhouse each day, collecting it in quiet bundles from behind the shed near the cemetery ridge. On a Tuesday, Ridge rode into town with a wagon full of cut hay lashed tight under canvas. He stopped just past the mercantile, lifted his hat to the blacksmith, then tied off his team beside the well. Delaney was leaving the sewing circle at the church when she saw him. She crossed the road without thinking, glancing once down at her boots where a bit of dried blood from a blister had darkened the leather. "You all right?" Ridge asked, nodding toward her limp. "Need to re-sole these," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. "Or grow calluses worth envying." "I've got a spare pair of boots Clara never wore," he said. "Unworn but strong stitched, might be a touch wide though." "I wouldn't feel right taking them," she replied, But I'll mend these for now." He leaned on the wagon rail. "You're stubborn." "I'm self-reliant." He gave a slow nod. "You're right. That's different." They stood there a while, the quiet between them filled with the creak of leather and the hum of wind through dry leaves. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked, voice low, not coy, just curious. "I think about what's missing and what could be mended," he said. "I think about what the children need. But mostly, I think about what makes the days feel like they're building towards something." She looked down at her hands, the knuckles raw from washing boards and chalk dust. "I wasn't sure anyone would ever ask me to be part of a life again." "I didn't ask," he said. "Not yet. But I'm fixing to." That evening, Delaney sat on the edge of her bed, holding a letter from her sister in Missouri. It spoke of babies and baked pears and a new roof on the mill house. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the box beneath her pillow. Then she lit the lamp and sat at the window, watching the wind bend low through the wheatgrass. Just before sunrise, Fern arrived early to the schoolhouse, cheeks flushed from the walk, a bundle under her arm. "I made this," she said, holding out a woolen scarf in pale gray. "I used the sheep's yarn you gave us. Thought maybe you'd want it if the snow came early." Delaney took it, fingers brushing the uneven stitches. "Thank you." Fern shifted from foot to foot. "I like when you come to supper. The house sounds different when you're there." Delaney folded the scarf over her arm. "I like it too." The first frost came 2 days later. Ridge sent Forrest to the schoolhouse with 2 eggs, a small wedge of cheese, and a folded note that simply said, "Come when you can." That night, Delaney arrived at the Johnson homestead with her hair braided back and her hands wrapped in linen gloves. Ridge met her at the fence, lantern swinging from his hand. "I've been thinking," he said as they walked toward the porch. "The children asked if we'd ever have a harvest dance again. We used to before Clara passed." Delaney stepped up beside him, the scent of wood smoke lingering from the hearth. "They deserve one." He paused, then looked at her, quiet and firm. "So do we." Inside, the table had been cleared and a small fiddle rested on the counter. Fletcher had already gathered stones to weight the corners of a canvas, and Fern had torn scraps of calico to make a banner. Ridge reached into the cabinet and pulled down a mason jar filled with dried apples. "I figure if we start soaking these tonight, we can make pies by Friday." Delaney ran a hand along the rim of the flour tin. "I have a jar of molasses and a bag of cinnamon sticks." "I'll bring them." He nodded once, then took a step closer. "I didn't ask the other night," he said, "but I'll ask now. Would you think about staying, not just for the supper or the harvest or the children, but for good?" Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the way the question landed so gently against her ribs. "I've thought about it," she said, "and I think I already am." He didn't kiss her, not yet. But he reached for her hand and held it, steady and sure, while the children argued over pie tins in the next room. And outside, beneath the blackening sky, the wind shifted again, slow, certain, and full of promise. The autumn dance came with the hush of late dusk, the kind where sky and earth met in a pale wash of lavender. The barn at the edge of Ridge's far pasture had been swept clear, the floor scrubbed with vinegar and lye. Lanterns hung from the rafters, their flame light flickering against the whitewashed wood. Pine boughs were tied with strips of faded ribbon, and beneath them stood neighbors who hadn't gathered in years. Delaney arrived with Fern, Fay, and Fletcher clinging to her arms, each of them dressed in their best. Forrest had ridden ahead with Ridge at first light, hauling the crates of apples and jars of spiced cider. The boy had tasked himself with guarding the pies from curious fingers, though by the time Delaney arrived, a quarter of one crust bore the unmistakable imprint of small teeth. She set the last of the molasses tarts on the table and turned to find Ridge standing in the open barn doors, the hem of his shirt tucked neat, his collar brushed smooth. He held a single sprig of dried goldenrod in one hand. "Didn't have much else left blooming," he said, offering it to her. "But I thought it'd suit." She tucked it into the ribbon at her waist without looking down. "It does." Music started slow, a fiddler and two boys with banjos, the rhythm more sway than step. Folks clapped gently, some too shy to move forward. But Ridge stepped in front of her, his hand open and sure. "You ever danced in a barn before?" he asked. She placed her fingers in his. "Not with someone I wanted to." They moved in time with the music, unhurried. Her boots brushed his hand at her back held firm, not possessive. When she glanced past his shoulder, she saw Fern showing Faye how to copy the steps and Forrest pretending not to care. "You've made a difference," Ridge said, voice low near her ear. "They sleep easier. They laugh more." Delaney looked up at him. "So do I." He stopped moving just long enough to brush his thumb along the edge of her jaw. "I've waited to feel this kind of peace again. Thought maybe it wasn't meant for me twice." She leaned into his hand, nothing between them but the dust and the music and the soft clatter of feet on wood. "It is." They danced until the fiddler's fingers tired. Afterward, Ridge walked her out beneath the stars, where the grass had gone brittle and the air smelled faintly of apples and smoke. He brought out a folded quilt and spread it beside the fence line. They sat without speaking for a while, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the warmth. "I've made arrangements," Ridge said finally. "If you're willing. The preacher'll come Sunday. The children want it small. Fern says she'll gather thistle and dry asters." Faye's set on wearing her Sunday gloves, even if they're too tight. Delaney rested her head against his shoulder. "You're sure?" "I was sure the first time you stopped talking when silence was enough." She drew in a slow breath. "Then yes." "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, soft and steady, the kind of kiss that came not from longing but from knowing, with no questions left to ask and no distance left to close. The wedding was held on a wind-bent Sunday morning, just after the frost lifted and before the hens had finished their clucking. Reverend Baker stood beneath the cottonwood near the Johnson porch, Bible open, voice worn but kind. Fern held the bouquet. Forrest and Fletcher fidgeted in their boots. Faye stood beside Delaney, gripping her hand with syrup-sticky fingers. Delaney wore her mother's brooch at her collar, the goldenrod still tucked at her waist. Ridge stood across from her with his sleeves rolled and his eyes steady. The lines at the corners softened in the morning light. When the vows were spoken and the hands joined, Ridge looked at her as though he'd never seen anything so real. She looked back, her heart full and still. That afternoon, they served apple cake and poured cider into chipped mugs. Neighbors came with jars of beans, loaves wrapped in cloth, offerings of salt and flour and goodwill. No one whispered anymore. No one questioned. Delaney was no longer the widow from Missouri. She was Ridge Johnson's wife. She was Fern, Forrest, Fletcher, and Faye's mother in every way that mattered. That night, after the children were tucked in and the fire had burned low, Delaney stood in the doorway of the homestead. Ridge came up behind her, wrapping a quilt around her shoulders. "It feels like we've always stood like this," he said. "We had to earn it first." He kissed the crown of her head and pulled her close. "We did." They stayed there until the stars wheeled high and the night settled full around them, their silhouettes framed in lamplight, two people no longer waiting to belong. Years passed. The schoolhouse grew fuller. Fern outgrew her braids and took to sketching birds in the margins of her lessons. Forrest learned to harness a team. Fletcher carved wooden whistles and tied them to fence posts. Faye learned to read with a lilt in her voice and a ribbon in her hair. And Delaney, once alone and half forgotten, spent her days among books and growing children, her nights beside a man who never asked her to be anything but herself. They grew old in that house, but never apart. And the days that came after were not quiet from emptiness, but from the peace they'd built between them, slow as the seasons, steady as the land.